Lagos was already alive by 6 a.m. Not just awake, alive. The kind of alive that honks, sweats, argues, and hustles. The city's arteries pulsed with impatience. Kiki drivers yelling routes, street preachers declaring apocalypse, market women hawking yam and survival. On most mornings, no one noticed the girl standing under the bridge. But this was not most mornings. Her name was Adana. She was 20. Thin, alert, wary, like someone who had been too young when she learned what hunger tastes like. Her hair was undone, her eyes sharp but exhausted. In her right hand, she clutched a black nylon bag. Inside, a half loaf of bread and 3 blister packs of antibiotics. That was breakfast, lunch, and triage for the day. The medicine wasn't for her. Near the edge of the sidewalk, laid out on flattened cartons, her mother coughed softly. A persistent sound, more breath than voice. Madame Sandra, once a schoolteacher, now barely moved. Adana was her nurse, daughter, and only lifeline. No one stopped. They rarely did. And then the Rolls-Royce arrived. It moved slowly, like a creature not used to the terrain. Lagos drivers don't slow for pedestrians. But this car did. Sleek, black, polished to the point of arrogance, it was designed for quieter streets. It didn't belong here. That's why people noticed. From the back seat, the door opened with the sigh of money. A man stepped out. Johnson Okafor. In Banana Island, he was legend. The man who made millions selling luxury sedans to men who didn't understand torque. He owned showrooms from Lagos to Abuja. He graced magazine covers with the same expression, unbothered wealth. Today, he wore a navy blue suit that looked imported and a gold wristwatch that didn't try to be discreet. He looked like he was headed to a boardroom, not a sidewalk. But he wasn't there to inspect traffic. He was walking, deliberately, toward the underbridge. Toward Adana. The street slowed. Even the noise seemed confused. A few pedestrians pulled out phones. The meat seller paused mid-slap of raw beef. Then Johnson knelt. Not figuratively. Not emotionally. Literally. On one knee, on the dusty pavement, beside the girl with torn slippers. He opened a small box. Inside, a diamond ring caught the morning light and reflected something close to madness. Adana, he said, his voice rich and steady. Will you marry me? There were audible gasps. Somewhere, a danfo braked too hard. Someone whispered, "Nah prank be this?" Another answered, "No fit be. That's Johnson Okafor." Adana didn't move. Her eyes flicked from the ring to the man, to the growing crowd, and finally to the figure lying on cardboard beside her. "I can't," she said. Her voice wasn't weak. It was clear, unshaken. The reaction was volcanic. She say no? To Johnson? This girl day crazo. But Johnson didn't flinch. Not outwardly. He simply looked up at her and asked, "Why?" Adana pointed to the woman under the bridge. "That's my mother. She's sick. I can't leave her." It was a quiet answer, but it hit harder than a slap. For the first time in a long time, something inside Johnson shifted. He stood, closed the ring box, walked past Adana, and without another word, bent down and lifted Madame Sandra in his arms. Adana stared, stunned. She ran after him, calling, "Wait, what are you doing?" "Taking her to the hospital," Johnson said. "Get in the car." She hesitated, then obeyed. The door shut. The Rolls-Royce drove off, leaving behind a marketplace now buzzing with confusion, gossip, and the scent of something strangely sacred. At the hospital, things moved quickly. Sandra was wheeled in. Nurses scrambled. A doctor asked questions in clipped tones. Johnson answered with money and authority. "Whatever she needs, do it," he said. He signed papers without reading. Paid deposits no one asked for. Adana watched, mute, from the corner. They told her to wait outside. She sat in a plastic chair bolted to the floor. Johnson sat beside her. No one spoke. People passed and stared. Some whispered. No one approached. A billionaire and a beggar girl waiting together wasn't a photo they knew how to caption. The doctor returned an hour later. "She's very weak. Malnourished. Infection in the lungs. We're starting her on 4 fluids and antibiotics. She has a chance, but recovery will be slow." Adana nodded slowly. Johnson said, "Whatever it takes." They moved Sandra to a quieter room. Johnson arranged for a private nurse. Adana tried to sleep sitting upright. Johnson took off his jacket and draped it over her. The next morning, he brought tea. She didn't drink it. "Eat something," he said. "Not until my mother eats." He said nothing. but something like respect passed across his face. By the second night, Sandra opened her eyes. Adana, she whispered. Where are we? Adana cried as she held her mother's hand. We're safe, Mama. We're not under the bridge anymore. Sandra's gaze shifted to Johnson. He nodded once. Thank you, she whispered. You don't owe me thanks, Johnson said. Just focus on healing. They stayed 4 days. On the 5th, Sandra could sit up. The doctor recommended rest, clean air, medication. Things the underbridge did not offer. You're coming with me, Johnson said. Both of you. Adana objected. Quietly, stubbornly. This isn't charity, he said. It's what I want. They moved into his home on Banana Island. Staff received them like family. A nurse was assigned. A room prepared. Not luxurious, just human. With curtains that moved in the sea breeze and a bed that didn't smell like dust. Adana stood in the doorway of her room for 5 full minutes before stepping in. You don't have to be afraid, Johnson told her. No one here will ask you to repay anything. That night, he knocked on her door. When your mother sleeps, he said, I'd like to hear your story, if you're ready. She nodded, and she told it. Everything. Her father who had stood against corrupt land sales. His death. The uncle who sold their home anyway. Her mother's collapse. The descent into poverty that had no bottom. I want to go to school, she said finally. I want to be someone before I become someone's wife. Johnson looked like someone had just solved an equation he'd been pondering for years. Then you will learn, he said. And I'll help. Adana didn't reply, but her eyes warmed. The next morning, a tutor arrived. Textbooks followed. Adana began studying for university entrance exams. Johnson gave her space, but not distance. He checked in without hovering, provided without controlling. In a house that had once been filled with silence and success, something else now grew. And it had nothing to do with money. It had to do with a girl who said no. Banana Island was not built for stories like Adana's. Yet, on a warm afternoon lined with sea breeze and suspicion, its gates opened to admit a barefoot girl and her ailing mother. Johnson Okafor didn't explain himself to anyone. The staff didn't ask questions. Orders had been given. Rooms were prepared. Bedsheets were changed twice. A nurse waited in the guest suite. The cook, confused but compliant, prepared rice with steamed vegetables. Adana followed Johnson through polished marble halls like someone trying not to wake from a dream. Her mother, lighter than she had ever been, was lifted once again, this time into a bed that smelled of lavender and clean money. Her own room had curtains that danced. A bed too big. A mirror she avoided. That night, sleep came to everyone except Adana. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mother breathing softly in the next room, and wondered when the dream would end. A knock came. Johnson, not in a suit now, just trousers, a simple shirt, and an expression unfamiliar to boardrooms. Patience. When your mother's asleep, he said, come to the study. If you feel like talking. He left her with the choice. Hours later, she came. Quietly. Past portraits of success and chandeliers that didn't flicker. Into a study with soft lighting and a view of the sea. Johnson didn't sit behind his desk. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring at the dark water. Tell me, he said. So she did. Her father, Andrew, had told his brothers not to sell their family's land. He said dignity mattered. 3 days later, men arrived with silence and machetes. No one took anything. They only destroyed what couldn't be replaced. After his funeral, her uncle sold the land anyway. They lost the house, the farm, the security of routine. The city didn't offer refuge. Her mother fell ill. Adana was too young to work and too old to beg without shame. But she begged anyway. She learned what hunger really was. Not just emptiness, but fear. Not just lack, but repetition. She held her mother's hand through seizures. She bartered with bus drivers. She slept with one eye open, guarding a woman who couldn't guard herself. She didn't cry as she told it. But Johnson, for once, had no rehearsed wisdom to offer. I don't want pity, she said finally. I want education. I want a life that's mine. Johnson nodded slowly. You'll have it. We start tomorrow. And they did. A private tutor arrived with past questions and a voice that did not tolerate excuses. Adana studied beneath windows that faced the sea. Math in the morning. Chemistry in the afternoon. Summary writing at night. Sticky notes bloomed across her walls. Read the question twice. Don't rush. Breathe. Johnson didn't hover. He passed by sometimes. Left fruit. Bottled water. Silence. His respect was unspoken, but heavy. Her mother, meanwhile, recovered. Slowly, Madame Sandra began walking around the garden, leaning on Adana's shoulder. The nurse showed her how to manage medications. The cook asked what they liked to eat. For the first time in months, choices were offered instead of scraped together. Then came the exam. On the morning of the test, Adana's hands trembled. "You'll be fine," Johnson said, handing her a pencil. "Just breathe." She did. When the results arrived, Adana read them alone. Then she cried. Then she ran to her mother. Then she showed Johnson. He didn't cheer, just nodded. A soft clap, like confirmation. 2 weeks later, the admission letter came. University of Port Harcourt. Faculty of Engineering. Automotive track. She stood in the hallway, staring at the screen. "It's real," she whispered. Her mother cried again. Johnson placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then it's time," he said. And it was. New clothes. New shoes. Not extravagant, just enough to walk into a lecture hall and not draw whispers. Johnson paid for registration, accommodation, books, transport. Quietly, like a man paying dues to fate. The morning she left, her mother hugged her with the strength of 10 past winters. Johnson stood by the car. "No fanfare. Come back when you're ready," he said. "The door is still open." Adana went to school like someone who had something to prove. Not to others, but to herself. She sat in front. Asked questions. Failed one quiz. Passed the next 5. She studied until midnight. Joined a study group. Cried once. Then studied again. During holidays, she came home. Her mother was stronger. Johnson asked no personal questions. Only one. "Are you still learning?" "Yes." "Then keep going." By her 3rd year, she earned a spot at Johnson Autos as an intern. No one knew who she was. She didn't use his name. She showed up early. Stayed late. Took notes. Asked to join test runs. She wrote a report on how Nigerian roads required a different kind of suspension. Johnson saw it. Sent it to R&D, quietly. Her professor emailed to say, "This is industry-level thinking." She smiled alone. Graduation came. The auditorium was loud. Her name was called. Her hands did not shake. Her mother clapped. Johnson clapped. She walked across the stage, holding not just a certificate, but her own becoming. That evening, Johnson asked her and Madame Sandra to meet him in the garden. The sea was soft. Lanterns glowed. A small band played low. Johnson knelt. No crowd. No show. Just this moment. "Adana," he said, "will you marry me now?" This time, she said yes. And the past didn't vanish. It bowed. The engagement didn't stay quiet for long. Lagos, always hungry for spectacle, caught wind within days. The blogs moved first. Tiny whispers on Instagram pages built on gossip and filters. Is it true? Johnson Okafor and a former Underbridge girl? Screenshots spread. Headlines swelled. Then came the newspapers. From dust to diamond. The woman who said no before saying yes. Billionaire's bride. A love story Lagos didn't expect. Comment sections flared with theories. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others, especially women who'd met Johnson in more glamorous years, called it a midlife crisis in a navy blue suit. But the ones who mattered most saw something else. They saw a second chance that didn't come wrapped in glitter, but in grit. Adana didn't say much. She didn't need to. She kept working. At Johnson Autos, she was no longer the intern, but a rising engineer with clear eyes and a stubborn work ethic. She led small teams, quietly rewrote design protocols. Some senior staff complained. She was too young, too different. But the numbers silenced them. Her upgrades cut maintenance complaints by 17%. Field agents said her designs felt like they were drawn by someone who knew how bad roads get after rain. In her free time, she studied. She wasn't done learning. At home, things shifted. Madame Sandra became the quiet matriarch of the house. The staff called her Mama. She didn't boss anyone. She didn't need to. She ruled gently, from the garden chair, humming songs no one remembered the words to. She smiled more. Coughed less. Johnson. He worked less. Or rather, he worked with more purpose. He began stepping back from the spotlight, declining speaking invitations, taking more walks by the water. And when asked, why her, by one particularly bold investor, he answered. She said no when it was easier to say yes. That tells me everything. The wedding planning began. It wasn't Adana's idea. Left to her, They would have signed papers, gone for fish pepper soup, and called it a day. But Johnson knew Lagos. This was a society of ceremonies. Silence would be misunderstood. Dignity had to be dressed. He didn't hire planners. He summoned them. From Abuja, Accra, even London, they came. The brief was simple, no pretension, but no apology either. This isn't a royal wedding, he said, but it must feel like one. Invitations were embossed. Guest lists handpicked. Governors, oil tycoons, tech entrepreneurs. Even 2 former Miss Nigerias RSVP'd. Not because of friendship, but curiosity. Everyone wanted to see the girl who had turned a Rolls-Royce proposal into a rescue mission. Adana remained quiet. Her joy was deep, but inward. She tried dresses in silence. She didn't squeal. She didn't flaunt. Once, in a fitting, she asked her mother, "What if people think I don't belong there?" Madame Sandra laughed. "My child, you've lived where they wouldn't survive 10 minutes. You belong more than they know." The week before the wedding, Banana Island bloomed in flowers. The garden transformed into a chapel. Security tightened. Helicopters hovered. But the house inside remained calm. Adana still woke early. Still reviewed engine blueprints. Still helped the cook fold chin-chin. She wasn't playing Cinderella. She was building something steadier than fantasy. Then came the wedding day. Church bells rang before dawn. Tailors whispered final prayers over their work. Guests arrived in convoys. 1,000 shades of lace and agbada filled the pews. The air smelled of perfume, anxiety, and admiration. Johnson stood at the altar in a white tuxedo. Hands steady, face calm. But in his chest, a quiet awe thumped like a second heartbeat. Then the doors opened. Adana entered, her hand in her mother's. She wore no tiara, no diamonds, no spectacle. Just a white dress, soft, flowing, simple. The veil didn't hide her. It framed her. The room exhaled. She walked like someone who'd walked harder roads. Chin lifted. Steps quiet. Beside her, Madame Sandra whispered. From cartons to carpet. From dust to altar. Walk proud. At the altar, Johnson took her hand. His eyes didn't glitter. They searched. The priest didn't preach long. He didn't need to. This love had already made its vows. Johnson said, "I will love you not for the fairy tale, but for the fire you survived. I will not only give you a ring, but a roof. Not only a house, but a home. I will stand beside you when things break, because I've seen how you repair." Adana said, "I will honor you not for what you own, but who you chose to be when no one was watching. I will walk with you in boardrooms and in dust, in plenty and in patience. I will not fear the road with you." They were pronounced husband and wife to the sound of standing applause and muffled sniffles, even from the men. But the moment that Lagos wouldn't forget came at the reception. The hall was gold. 5-tiered cake. Rose petals on the table. A live orchestra. Then Madame Sandra stood to speak. She wore a wrapper so bright it dared the chandeliers to outshine her. Her voice, when it came, was gentle and firm. "There was a time the world forgot me and my only daughter," she said. "We slept under a bridge. We begged for medicine. We were invisible. But one day, this man," she gestured to Johnson, "came down from his car and lifted not just my daughter, but me. He didn't buy us. He didn't pity us. He honored us. And today, I give him my blessing not because he is rich, but because he is kind." Silence. Then thunderous applause. Not polite clapping. Real, hard-hitting applause. Some guests wept. A few rose to their feet. A wedding had turned into a testimony. Married life began quietly. Adana moved into her new title, Mrs. Okafor, with grace. She returned to her role at Johnson Autos, now with more responsibility. Her desk remained the same. Her expectations doubled. Johnson never hovered. But every time she succeeded, he watched with pride too large for words. Evenings were quiet. They cooked together. Sometimes she cooked, he chopped. Sometimes neither of them did. And they sat in silence, reading by the sea breeze. They didn't rush children. They didn't rush status. They simply built. 1 year later, a new sound filled the house, a baby's cry. Adana gave birth to a daughter. Round cheeks. Tiny fists. "What shall we name her?" Johnson asked, holding the newborn like glass. Adana looked down, eyes wet. "Grace," she whispered, because nothing else made more sense. Grace arrived like dawn, soft, necessary, undeniable. She didn't cry often. She watched. Like her mother, She studied the world first, reacted second. Johnson held her like he'd been waiting to exhale. Adana held her like someone who remembered sleeping on cartons and now cradled a future. Madame Sandra sang lullabies from a village that didn't exist on Google Maps. The household adjusted. Sleep became a rare commodity, but laughter came more often. Adana took 3 months off work, not because it was expected, because she wanted to. She spent mornings with Grace, evenings with her mother, nights studying industry reports between feedings. She didn't want to lose her edge. She didn't want the world to say she changed and mean she softened. Johnson didn't suggest otherwise. He simply adjusted the company's calendar around her return date. When she came back to Johnson Autos, she didn't come quietly. She presented a redesign for a compact vehicle built for narrow streets and inconsistent fuel quality. Her pitch? Efficiency shouldn't be elite. The boardroom paused. Someone tried to interrupt. Johnson raised a hand. Let her finish. She did. The design was approved. Production began. The car launched 6 months later. Sales surpassed projections by 38%. Customers in Enugu, Kano, and even Togo wrote in, "This is the first car I've driven that feels like it knows where I live." The press called her the engineer who remembers the road. Adana shrugged. "I just don't forget where I started." Grace turned one. The garden filled with balloons and relatives who had once turned away. Now they came bearing gifts and apologies. Adana accepted one of those. The rest, she let Johnson handle, with polite silence and strategic seating arrangements. That evening, after the last guest left, she stood at the balcony holding Grace. Johnson came up beside her. They didn't speak for a while. Then she asked, "Do you ever think we're living too much in a dream?" He answered, "No. Dreams don't have traffic, deadlines, and teething problems." She laughed. Quiet, tired, honest. Then came the letter. From the village. Her father's village. An old neighbor had passed. In his will, he'd named Adana. Left her a strip of land. For the girl who honored her father's name. She stared at the paper for hours. Johnson didn't say much. Just asked, "Do you want to go?" "I have to." 2 weeks later, they drove into the past. The village was smaller than her memory. The road was worse. But the people, they looked at her differently now. Some with awe, some with regret, a few with shame. She walked to the plot of land in the morning, stood in silence. The grass had grown wild. The soil was red. The air smelled of firewood. Johnson stood a few steps behind. "What will you do with it?" he asked. Adana took her time. "Build something that wasn't allowed before. A school. Not a fancy one. Just enough for girls who are told books are luxury." He nodded. "Good." They returned to Lagos. And the work began. Adana didn't outsource. She designed it herself. Sourced the materials. Hired local workers. Traveled every month to supervise. Johnson offered help. Financial, logistical. But she made the calls. She chose the paint. The sign went up 8 months later. Andrew Memorial Academy. For girls who dream. At the opening, Adana didn't make a speech. She stood by the gate, watching girls in dusty uniforms walk in with heads tilted high. One journalist approached. "Why this project?" She replied, "Because no child should have to beg for aspirin and dignity at the same time." He didn't ask another question. Grace grew. So did the whispers. Is she going into politics? Is she building a brand? Is she trying to be first lady of something? Adana ignored them. She knew Lagos. It always needed a story. She chose to be the one writing it. Johnson, meanwhile, began stepping further out of the day-to-day at the company. He handed more to his directors. Traveled less. Stayed home more. One evening, while watching Grace play with blocks, he said to Adana, "You ever wonder what I'd be if you hadn't said no?" She looked at him. "Lonely," she said, then added, "or remarried to someone who'd sell your Bentley when your credit card paused." He laughed, loud and genuine. Touché. The house became a hub for calm, for healing, for strategy. Adana began mentoring young female engineers. She hosted informal dinners with women in tech and design. No speeches. Just wine, pepper soup, and blueprints. She never posted about it. But the ripple spread. Young women began writing to Johnson Autos, asking for internship programs. Some addressed letters to engineer Adana Okafor. Some just wrote, "To the lady who said no first." Madame Sandra watched all of it. Proud. Still humming. Still watching sunsets. One day Grace, now 5, asked her, "Grandma, why do you always sit outside?" Sandra replied. Because once I lived under the sky. Now I live by the sea. I like to keep them both close. Johnson heard it from the corridor. He didn't interrupt, just smiled slightly. At dinner, Grace announced she wanted to be an engineer like Mama and a driver like Papa. Johnson raised an eyebrow. Driver? Grace grinned. You drive me to school every day? Fair enough. Later that night, Adana stood at the window again. Same sea, same wind. Johnson joined her. You built something that can't be bought, he said. She turned. What? Dignity. Legacy. The kind that lives longer than cars or conferences. Adana looked down, then up. So what now? He smiled. Now we rest. Then we build again. Time didn't slow down for anyone, not even for those who once stopped traffic in Lagos. But some people age into their legacy instead of away from it. Adana Okafor, now in her early 40s, wasn't called the billionaire's wife anymore. Not often, at least. She was Madam Engineer, Madam Director, or, by a younger generation, simply Ma. Not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. Her work at Johnson Autos had long passed the point of novelty. She wasn't a token success. She was the engine room. By now, she led the innovation division. She had patents under her name. She had whiteboards covered in road dust equations. She had scars from prototypes that failed. She had victories she never tweeted. More importantly, she had interns, eager, hopeful, scared young women who sat across from her during office hours with trembling voices and trembling ideas. To each one, she said what no one had said to her under the bridge. You're not too late. You're not too poor. You're not too broken. And they believed her. Because the lines in her palm weren't manicured, they were mapped. Johnson watched this unfolding like someone watching a second sunrise. He still chaired meetings when necessary, still negotiated deals with quiet sharpness. But he no longer carried the company. He passed the weight, not out of fatigue, but trust. Grace, now 16, was the product of contrast. She wore second-hand jeans, but built first-class code. She spoke in both slang and Shakespeare. She asked hard questions. She listened harder. She called Adana my hero once. Adana pretended not to hear it, but later cried in the laundry room for 10 minutes. At school, Grace led the robotics club. Not for clout, because machines made more sense than people, and soldering wires gave her peace. One evening, after dinner, she asked her father, "Can I intern at a different company? I want to earn it like Mama." Johnson, fork halfway to his mouth, paused, then smiled. You already are your mother's daughter. And so she went. Quietly. No last name mentioned. No security detail flaunted. Just her and her toolbox. Back home, Madame Sandra, older now, slower, still ran the house from her garden bench. Staff still greeted her with a reverence not born of fear, but of story. She hummed louder these days, sometimes gospel, sometimes silence. She'd lived through shame, sickness, and salvation. She owed no one explanations, only prayers. One afternoon, a government official called. The National Engineering Council wanted to honor Adana for contributions to public transport design. They asked for a speech. She hesitated. What do I say? She asked Johnson. He answered, the truth. The part most people are afraid to say. So she stood before the council that weekend. In a hall full of men with polished shoes and long titles, she spoke plainly. Innovation isn't born in air-conditioned rooms. It's born in heat, in traffic, in breakdowns, in children walking 10 kilometers to school. I wasn't made in a lab. I was made under a bridge. And I will never design like I forgot that. Silence. Then applause. Then a standing ovation. After the ceremony, a young engineer approached. I live in Mushin. I use public buses every day. Your designs changed my route. It takes half the time now. Adana smiled. Good. Use the extra time to build something better. In private moments, Johnson and Adana grew softer. Their conversations were shorter, but heavier. They didn't need many words. They'd lived them already. Once, on their anniversary, Johnson surprised her, not with diamonds or destinations, but with something quieter. A small bench, simple wood, placed under a tree near the sea. A brass plaque read, "For the girl who turned no into forever." Adana touched it gently, then sat. Johnson joined her. You remember the day I asked you? He asked. She laughed. I remember everything, especially the dust. They sat in silence. The sea didn't roar. It breathed. Years passed. Grace got into university on merit. Not Port Harcourt. Not abroad. She chose the University of Lagos. She said, "If Mama could rise from here, so can I." The school didn't advertise her presence, but word spread. And once, when a professor made an offhand comment about girls not belonging in mechanics, Grace stood and recited her mother's first patent line for line. The class went quiet. The professor retired the next semester. Back home, Johnson grew slower. Not weaker, just quieter. One morning, Adana found him staring out the window. She walked over. "What are you thinking?" He answered, "Nothing. And that's the luxury I never had until I met you." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Rest is not weakness." He nodded. "It's what I was chasing all those years. I just didn't know." They began passing things down. Files, properties, stories. When Grace graduated, she didn't throw a party. She sat with her parents, ate pepper soup, and said, "Now I start my own path." And she did. A few years later, Madame Sandra passed. Not in a hospital, not on cardboard, but in her bed, by the window, overlooking the sea. Her last words were a prayer in Igbo. Her hands were held by daughter, granddaughter, son-in-law. The house fell quiet for weeks. Then, slowly, music returned. Grace played jazz now. Adana walked longer in the garden. Johnson, now mostly retired, started writing notes, memories, sometimes letters to no one. One day, Adana found one. It read, "They said I gave her a better life. But truth is, she gave me one. The kind of life that starts with no, survives dust, and ends with peace. If this house remembers anything of me, let it be this." She chose her mother, then chose herself. Only then did she choose me. Adana folded the letter, placed it beside Grace's baby bracelet. Legacy, it turned out, wasn't about what people said after you were gone. It was about how people lived because you stayed. And so, under the same sky that once felt too far away, a story ended. Not in noise, not in gold, but in grace.